So we're all back again. Ready to start, Martijn?
Yeah, sure. I hope you all enjoyed lunch. Your well-deserved lunch break after your hard work this morning. So yeah, let's move on with writing. So another kind of communication, you could say, different situation. And maybe, well, I guess we're all familiar with writing. Most of us have done it, and you needed to do it, maybe already back in school, and now as well, and now in academia, while doing your PhD and doing research, your writing often becomes scientific writing, so a typical kind of writing. So that is what this 2-hour workshop is about. A little introduction into what you could think of, what it is, and how you could use it. Maybe this style is recognizable for some of you. I'm not sure that you see here. Some of you might think carefully about each word before typing it, and others might keep pressing random buttons and hope something coherent comes out. Probably it's somewhere in between. But what's typical about writing as well is that we all tend to have different approaches to it and personal styles, and it also all personal styles in the sense that our writing process can be different. And we tend to approach the process of writing differently. And in the end, it doesn't necessarily have to matter for the outcome. So you can have different ways that lead to a good, coherent text. But there might be some general characteristics of what we, in an academic paper or in academic writing, is considered good, coherent writing that we can take into account. So that is what I hope to touch upon today. And first, I'd like to discuss, first a few of your experiences with writing, just as with the first workshop, just to hear, what are challenges that you have. And then we move on to, what is the rhetorical situation and the genre of academic writing? How can we define that so that we know what we're talking about here, what kind of writing? And again, I would like to focus today on introductions, what is typical in a scientific introduction. And I've asked you to look at a few papers and to find a few key papers you think are useful for yourself if you would start writing a paper, and then as references, and then see what they do in their introductions. Also because introductions are a fairly accessible part of the paper that you can start writing already. It doesn't have to be the final version, but that you can start writing without already having too much of the bulk content or the core of the matter in the results part, for example, or the methods. And then you will also start writing that introduction yourself a little bit, start off with that, and then we can see how far you can get and compare some examples. If we have enough time, I could also focus a bit on writing clear paragraphs, but I guess within 2 hours this is already a nice start, and we'll just see how far we will get. So first, what challenges do you face in writing? So for example, about your research, I'd like to hear from you. What do you think is challenging in writing? Or maybe you don't think anything is challenging in writing, and then you could share with us why you think it's something that you like doing, or that you don't really think is challenging. So could anyone perhaps share his or her thoughts on that? What do you come across when writing?
I think when we are writing like research, for example, article or paper, I think we have to take care about so-called plagiarism. Yeah, because for what we write, sometimes like I'm thinking that like is it like these sentences like already used by another researcher? Because for example, if you use some software to check about the plagiarism or the similarity index, it could be quite fit. But yeah, at the end we should like change again the sentence into the right one. Yeah, that's all.
Thanks, Harry. So plagiarism is a challenge, can be a challenge sometimes, or how to avoid that, perhaps more, or in the sense that it's something to keep in mind, right? That you need to be aware of that, because of course you use sources, and that's commonly accepted, or that's expected in a scientific paper, of course. But then how to use the sources properly. Without committing plagiarism. That's paraphrasing something, using your own words while still doing justice to the idea can sometimes be a challenge. And you don't always want to quote it, because quoting or using a literal quote, you only do in specific circumstances, right? When it's really about the exact phrase or definition or something, when it really matters how it is formulated. But if that's not the case, yeah, it's a scientific paper that only consists of quotes is not really readable. So that's not what you really want as well. You would want it to be text of your own, and you would want to show that you master the subject. Okay, so any other things that you run into when writing?
One thing I usually find is that it's sometimes a bit difficult to transport your research, which is usually not that easy, into more easier topics, sentences. And most of the times it's easy if you can write tons of pages, but once you have to synthesize, sometimes it might become a bit complex to write short sentences and very simple, but also dealing with your research.
Yeah. So how to do justice to the topic and still write an accessible text, right? That's quite challenging in academic writing, and especially in certain parts of the text, which perhaps should do a bit more than perhaps the introduction, but also the conclusion, which are also a little bit argumentative, where you need to build a case for why you're doing something, why it's important, why you're focusing on this specific topic, and you ask this specific research question. There you also want it to be interesting to a reader, and not just clear. It should always be clear, but perhaps you would also want it to be a good reading experience for someone who reads the text. That I can imagine that it's we had a public speaking, or we talked about presenting, and that's a different situation. And of course, we will talk in the in this workshop about writing now. We will talk much more about academic writing as a genre, which has a much more conventions you need to take into account, you could say, and then that's a challenge. Okay. Anything else? Anyone else who would like to share what you?
Sometimes smooth switch between different concepts. I find it difficult in switching between them, narrating different ideas and single paragraph.
Okay, so how to connect different ideas. And so you often have to include various concepts, but then you also want to have sort of an overarching storyline, and you don't want it to be just a mix and match of a few different topics that you put together, but you also want your reader to understand your train of thought. And Gabriela already mentioned the term topic sentence, which could be handy there, right? So how to connect those dots, that's indeed. So yeah, I guess if there aren't any other experiences that you would like to share, I guess that it does underline nicely what you mentioned, how I think what the typical rhetorical situation is, you could say, in academic writing. Let's see, I'm sharing my slides here. Yeah, here we are. So it seems similar. You have an audience, which now is a reader, and you have a writer, not a speaker, and you have a message, which is a text. And there are similar elements to it, but it is, I think, it is still a bit different, because you have an audience or reader that is now not depending on you as a medium. So you're, as a speaker, you're not in between your message and your audience, but the text is. So the audience or the reader can determine his or her own pace and read the text by him or herself, and that is, yeah, quite a significant difference, I think, with a public speaking situation. Ultimately, there are also lots of similarities, because still you have to think of who your reader is, and what, you know, whether it's someone who has a broader, doesn't have an exact knowledge of the topic, but is perhaps more of a broader audience, or whether you write for really close colleagues who have lots of shared knowledge, right? And then you would start off differently, perhaps. But there are also differences, and one of the challenges is, I think, that you need to integrate multiple knowledge domains. So you could say you have the content, which is your scientific text, which is your topic, and the topic that you do research in, and then that is also where your expertise lies, and at the same time you also have to think of what is the genre, what kind of text am I publishing? Is it a paper? Is it a dissertation? Is it a more popular scientific text? Who is my audience? What is my purpose in writing for them, which is more the rhetorical situation, and they are all closely related, of course. How should I use language? So what are conventions there? What does a reader expect in that specific genre? So if you expect to read an academic paper within your own field, you have certain expectations of a text, and you usually don't want to be surprised, but you wanted to fulfill those expectations. And the process, which can be a challenge as well. So then how do I start? And what are the best steps to take? Where to start off writing? Should I start off immediately writing text, or should I first make a blueprint or a structure or an overview, and then start writing? Do I revise a lot? Do I feel that my text should be almost perfect after one version, or do I need lots of versions before I get to the final text? And what does that mean for my planning, for example, when writing a text? So that also is an important aspect, and that together, should in the end lead to an academic, a good academic text. And I think what's important when you write, when thinking of writing, that it has a lot to do with genre. Typically in an academic text, it's that is a certain genre, which means that readers have expectations. For example, on language use, there are certain patterns that you can recognize that many of these writers, academic writers, use, and that has grown over time. It has evolved, and that is now formed itself into a specific discourse. So, I think this is a nice quote, that the genre are socially constructed, typified responses to recurring rhetorical situations, which just means that, in an academic context, you're often exposed to this specific situation where you have to write a text for quite often close colleagues within the same field, and then because that happens a lot, these texts tend to show the same kind of pattern and structure. So that is also helpful when you have to write these texts, if you can recognize these patterns and if you can see, hey, this is how I can build up a text and this is how I can organize my paper. I guess the typical structure of an academic paper is not a surprise to you, right? With an abstract, an introduction, method, results, and discussion. So the AIMRAD or the IMRAD structure. But that is also a result of, yeah, the typical information that is often expected in such a paper. And of course, there are variations, and in humanities, this is not always the normal or conventional structure, but yeah, in many scientific disciplines, this is, especially if it's about experimental or empirical research. So today I want to look at the introduction and take that as an example of a typical academic text section, part of an academic text, and try to understand what happens there, and yeah, also think of some other good practices when it comes to writing introductions, but perhaps also structuring a text in general, which might also apply to other sections. But when we take the introduction as example, yeah, we might also understand how to apply that on to other parts of the text. So the introduction, you could say, and often contains background information, is typically a part of a paper. If we take a look at an academic paper, right, that is most linked to the real world context, but also your own community of practice, or the discipline, your colleagues. The introduction and the conclusion usually have a link to that, right? Those the introduction usually starts off broadly and then narrows down, and then in the conclusion you move from your purpose and answer to that main aim or question again broadly to the implications. So you can see a reverse kind of structure. And then in the middle there are really usually very specialistic parts of an academic paper, where you have methods and results, which are often best accessible for people who really want to replicate or understand these types of results that you're obtaining. So what does a scientific introduction actually do in general? And I asked you to take a look at that. And the assignment was, well, let's say you plan to submit a paper to an academic journal about your project case that you're going to work on this week. First, find a few papers that you could use as references in that paper. Make sure that you can access them. So I hope that you have them with you right now. And to take a close look at the paper's introduction section. So first question was, how are they structured? Do they contain a clear storyline? And the second was, do you see similarities and differences? So do you see similar things going on in that section in terms of structure or language use, perhaps also? How the section is organized, and do you also see different things going on, and why might that occur? So I'm curious to see what you thought and what you found. So would there be anyone interested in sharing what you saw happening in these introduction sections, and how you could summarize that? And if you want to share your screen, I think that might be possible as well. So then you could show an example. Who could shed some light on that? No one? Have you?
Okay, so I will try.
Yeah, nice. It's not a, there's no right or wrong here in that sense. I mean, what did you see happening here?
First of all, I think that they show the general research area. So they explain like the general one, then they identify the gap that they have, and then sometimes they list the research questions. In my case, I don't really see these research questions in engineering papers, but in business, yes. And then they announce the principal findings, but this is actually sometimes in the introduction and sometimes in the abstract.
Okay. Thanks, Lace. Yeah, so you, they explain the general topic or field, you say, yeah, and then identify a gap. So, and then from that they move to the question. And you say that sometimes they list the multiple research questions, but in engineering you didn't really see. What did they do that in? What did they do in engineering?
Because in engineering it's more like you want to test, for example, a concrete, and then you test different ratio of cement and water and all that. But in business they have more qualitative research, sometimes quantitative and in statistics, and then they have these questions. I don't know how to say it now. I have to look at it.
Yeah, okay.
But then they usually about the objective of the main goal of the paper, they do some research questions to test the hypothesis.
Right. Yeah. So it's more phrased as an aim or a hypothesis.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Not always as a question. Okay. Yeah. Anyone who has found other things, or Priya? Yeah.
Yes. Just to add to what she said, so you basically have the global picture or general introduction about a broad, big picture, and then they split the sections into the topics that they are addressing in the paper itself. For instance, if it is self-healing and concrete, they discuss about concrete separately, and then they move into self-healing. So like 2 or 3 paragraphs with the state of art in that particular field. And then finally they conclude with what that paper is going to talk about in relation to the previous topics that they have discussed in the previous paragraphs or lines. And this pattern I saw in all the 3 different papers. So that was something common in all the 3 papers.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think you nicely explained what Lais has phrased as identifying the gap, right? So that is all work that is needed to identify what the gap is that your paper is going to fill, right? So these different steps of moving from a broader topic to how it then is narrowed down to what the state of the art is, and often it means that there is something in the state of the art that is not yet known, or there's something conflicting, or based on what has been done before. There is a lack of knowledge here, or something needs to be more precisely investigated or detail. There needs to be further work on, building on what previous studies have already been done. There can be multiple ways in how that gap is phrased, but that is sort of the argument for why you're posing a certain question or why your paper has a certain aim. So everything that is before the research aim or question you could see as argumentative work, building a case for why you are making or asking or posing that specific question, especially because your own question usually, or aim is usually very specific, right? So you also have to account for why exactly that specific thing you are interested in is actually worth being interested in. And even for colleagues, you have to be clear about that. At the same time, you also want to show, what tradition it stems from. So where you're coming from, and that you understand what is going on in that discipline, so that you can also pose the right question, right? So that is also a reason why you are arguing for that. Yeah. So were there any other things that you noticed in these introductions? I think these are very clear patterns already that you saw. And you saw different things going on, or things that you didn't expect, perhaps, or that papers differed from how they approached it?
Hello. I chose for 3 experimental papers, but I already have difficulty to choose this one because it's possible to choose for a review paper as well. And in the review paper, it's different, the idea to organize. But in these 3 papers that I search, it's very similar. They all tell the history of the concrete, the cracks, degradation, how to improve, then describe the self-healing method to the mechanisms applying these papers, and englobe some part of review the related studies about this to connect with the literature already have about this, and in the end show some objectives and relevance of the research, but in 2 specific papers is related to pass the lab scale to large scale, and in these 2 cases they use some paragraphs to describe the projects, the background of the research involving in these studies. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, so sometimes you see that happening as well, that the background is more elaborated more on, so also sort of not just the background of the contents, but perhaps also the background of how this study came about, for example. Yeah, and I think you also touched upon a good point, Vanessa, that a review paper is indeed another kind of genre. Yeah, where but it is an academic genre, but it is also another kind of academic text where you see that there might be different conventions. You also have to argue for why you've reviewed all these sources and want to show, for example, the state of the art in a certain field, but then of course there is a different kind of question or aim that you pose, and the approach is also different than the method. Yeah, so and then you see that there is also a certain pattern in those kind of review papers. Yeah, so it's good to distinguish those. Thanks. And what happens after the aim or the question has been posed? Do you see similar things going on there as well? Does the introduction end with the aim or the main question, or is there do you see some paragraphs or information that follows the aim?
Can I talk? Can you hear?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
In my point of view, after the question, we can explain about the future steps and the plan of the papers in general, and then start the next, for instance, sections.
Yeah. So with future steps, that often includes the approach, right, or the method in general.
Yes.
And sometimes you see that there is an outline of the paper. Section 2 discusses this or that. If you have a very typical setup of a paper, you know, the IMRAD structure, you don't have to explain what it is, how it is structured. But if you deviate from that, then it makes sense to explain that. And then the method section, of course, describes the method in detail, and it should be replicable often. So you should follow those steps. Be able to follow those steps. But what happens in the introduction is that often after the aim, the approach is or the method is argued for, or it's shown, you know, that why a certain approach has been chosen, just typically to answer this kind of question. So is it an experiment, or is it a design, or what kind of method do you use, and why is that a suitable approach to answer that specific question that you answered? So that's also what often happens in an introduction at the very end. Okay, so I think you can already see that based on what you saw, that there is, yeah, you can recognize that pattern quite well in various papers. So I would like to show you, let's see, that this is a pattern that indeed is recognized more often, and that's actually quite generalizable for almost any kind of academic paper. And then, of course, based on the type of research that you're going to do and the method there and the discipline, there are different conventions, but overall, as Swales and Fiek, which is a very nice book actually as well to use. It's a good resource, academic writing for graduate students. But they've also done quite some analytical work on research papers, and they explain it as follows, similar to quite some ingredients that you've just summarized. First, a research territory is established, and the territory is a general problem to be solved, a technological opportunity, and the kind of study or kind of discipline that we find ourselves in. And then a niche or gap is identified, and that might be a promising new approach, a technical challenge. Well, that is that gap that we just discussed, right? Which follows from previous research, usually, or the state of the art. And then your paper occupies that niche or gap. So that should follow logically from what you've just established as missing or lacking in knowledge, or contradictory, for example. And then references and sources are key, especially in that identifying niche or a gap, and when you vouch for your approach or method. Yeah, so that is a pattern that you really see almost anywhere in an introduction, a scientific introduction, and based on, well, for example, the rhetorical situation. So the audience, if you publish in a journal paper, then you can expect a much more expert audience. So maybe you start off on a different level with that, establishing the research territory, whereas if you write a dissertation, you might think of a slightly more broader audience. So maybe you would also start on a slightly different level and a bit broader level, perhaps. So that is where these academic texts can differ in approach, but overall, yeah, you'd really see that these similar functions of an introduction. It defines a research area, it identifies a gap in current knowledge, it states the goal of the research, it explains essential background concepts and theories, so especially the ones that you need to know to understand the specific goal that you're putting forward. It summarizes possible approaches and justifies the chosen approach, and it highlights the significance of the work. So that's also something that you regularly see. So how does this work then contribute to the discussion or the questions that are in the field? So there you have your introduction, yeah, the function of your introduction and the pattern that you usually see. More simplified, you could think of there's a problem, a possible solution, which follows from previous studies, which leads to a gap, and that should lead to your aim or main question. And then the question is, of course, that's clear, but then how to put that into writing in your text. So I've looked for a self-healing paper, and yeah, I'm not an expert, of course, but I just chose one that I found and just tried to see what in the language use, right? So based on the broader pattern, now we are zooming in on how can you see that pattern reflected in the text and in the choices of language that and formulations and phrases that writers make. How can you really see that? You see that, for example, in typical word choice and in topic sentences and in structure markers. So conjunctions moving from one step in the introduction, for example, from establishing the research territory to identifying a niche. And how does that work? What mechanisms can you see? Well, in this example, you see that establishing the research territory and importance, a common type of defects, right? So the word defects signifies a problem, there is something going on, and that's common, right? So that's widespread. So that's a typical general issue that has been established there, which is essential and unavoidable. So that's also urgent and it's important. That is writers at work showing their importance of their work, you could say. And that happens in the first paragraph here, and you see that there are no references yet, so it means that it's very generally put. So that's the broader research territory that's been defined. And then it moves and it further establishes the importance, but then corroborates that with examples and with references, right? So why is this problem occurring? Well, it presents arguments for the problem that's in place. Currently, there maintenance and repair of concrete structures generally rely on inspection programs which are expensive, something that you generally don't want. And there is a reference. Vast amounts of money are spent each year, so that's a new paragraph a little bit further on, which is clearly relating to expensive, right? So you see that there is a pattern at work here, building on these previous arguments. For instance, and then we see 3 or 4 different references that vouch for and that show a few examples. And then after the research territory and the problem have been established, there is a clear move from the problem to the possible solution. And that often works with topic sentences and clear use of structure markers or conjunctions, right? You see that moreover still signals that there is another argument presented to support the problem. Therefore, a little later, there's a new paragraph there, therefore developing innovative technologies, that's clearly some sort of conclusion that wraps up the problem, right? And there is a need, an urgent need for these innovative technologies. So that's already moving towards the possible solution there. The main mechanisms, right, of autogenic self-healing have not reacted due to, okay, so that's still specifying there is a possible solution, but it's not optimal yet, with supportive references. In contrast, right, so you see that there's also a clear structure marker highlighting a relation between what has just been put forward. There's a contrast. Many systems and techniques have been investigated to heal concrete cracks autonomically, such as, and then an explanation and references follows. So then the final step, there is a gap. They had been expected to be widely used, but this potential has not been extensively researched. So there is a clear relation to the previous research there. These studies presented limited data, so that's also typically a phrase that you can find to establish the scientific gap or the knowledge gap, right? This is an example in a paper on self-healing, but it could just as well be a sentence that is used in a very different discipline, which also vouches for a certain gap. Thus, this paper aims at. So there is at the beginning of the final paragraph in this introduction there, the gap is occupied and the aim is presented with a thus linking it to the gap, right? So that it follows from what has just been stated. Now, I'm not saying that this is the ideal paper, because I think if we would scrutinize it, I think on lots of papers, also papers that have been published, there might be different reviews of the paper possible, not just content-wise, but also in terms of structure or organization or language. But it does show how these functions of an introduction pan out on a sentence level and linguistic level, and that quite often these similar mechanisms are at work there, right? So that there are rhetorical moves that are translated to these the use of specific phrases that highlight to a reader, despite of the detailed technical content, what kind of relation and what kind of step is taken there, what the next move is, the next step is towards that main aim that has been posed. So based on that, maybe you have questions so far, and then otherwise we can move to a next step, which is that you start just trying to write a first part of an introduction based on the typical pattern that you have, that you've seen, and the resources that you have, and the references that you found. Are there any questions so far? Yeah?
Well, most of the literature review or introduction follow a story from the past to the recent research, and always the researchers want to show their novelty. They always say this cliche experience that all of this research present limited data or something. That is there any way, because the recent paper, for example, in 2019, well, it's a little exaggerated to say that it has a limited data. Is there any option to express our novelty rather than diminish the others' research? For the others, for instance, they have limited research. No, I just have something more than theirs.
Yeah, well, I think it's a bit of a matter of framing in that sense. Well, you can say that I can understand that you feel that it's that it comes across as if you're sort of negatively reflecting on others' work when you say they present limited data. It's not the same as saying that their research is limited, right? It just says that what we don't yet know. This is a new step, but we don't yet know enough. And you could also phrase it that way, right? So you can phrase it sort of positively and say, you don't say that there is limited data, but you say this has brought us one step further to understanding this or that. However, still this and that is needed to complete the picture, right? Or something like that. And that could also be a way to phrase it, and not saying that it's limited. Yeah. So I guess that it's more about the function it has in the text and the exact words that you choose. And I agree that maybe you don't always want to be too negative about what has been done before. Yeah. So that might be a good reason for trying to change the conventions a little bit, Sina. And also, I think yeah, you see that these similar patterns are at work often, that you see that it moves from older research to more recent research. And I think it's good to be aware of the patterns and to try and to follow the patterns, because readers expect those. Readers of a scientific paper expect that an introduction has those steps, but you should also be careful not to just do it by default, right? So there should be a reason why you present previous research chronologically, and if there is no reason why you do that chronologically, then you should start to think, why, what are the relations in the previous work that I should highlight then? It should be perhaps more based on contents and similarities in, approach, for example, instead of just organizing it by year, right? So I think there you should always remain critical. So there is a sort of a tightrope to walk in the sense of following similar patterns, but still trying to make sure that it's your own text, which has it's original in the sense that it focuses on what you think is important and what you think is needed to present at that stage. Yeah. And not just because someone else does it that way that you also need to do it that way, right? Yeah. Okay. So, but a good point. Yeah. So, yeah, what I would like to ask you, if there are no further questions, is to make a start with your own introduction. So, to, let's say here, take 30 minutes in a sort of a pressure cooker writing assignment, and you can, let's make it 35 minutes, so that you can also take a part of this 30 minutes as a break, right? Because we also need a little break, but maybe you can catch a cup of coffee and then in the meantime reflect on what you want to do and then start writing. But just to start writing a few paragraphs of the introduction section of a paper that you could write on self-healing, or the topic of this week's Smartings training school, and just start off broadly, right? So think of these functions of an introduction: establish a research territory, what's the relevance of the topic, and then identify a niche or a gap, and there you might be able to use the key references that you found and or other references that you know of, perhaps. Right? What are their challenges? What are their limitations? And if you get that far, maybe occupy the gap and present the name of the paper. It doesn't have to be a perfect text, so don't worry about that. It's just a way to start and to just start writing. And yeah, we can analyze papers as much as we want, and we can talk a lot about writing, but it's also nice in a writing workshop to actually write something yourself and to start doing it. And then we can afterwards perhaps compare a few examples and see how you've approached it. So take until, well, let's take until 3:25, right? So for 35 minutes from now. And then you can show what you have so far. Okay. Okay. So, do you still feel your fingers? Yeah. How far have you gotten? How many paragraphs have you written? Who has written?
5.
5. Wow. Great, Kiran. Anyone who can top 5?
Yeah, I'm 5 as well.
5. Nice. Okay, yeah, of
I
course
wrote
you can have 6.
Yeah,
Great.
I wrote.
You wrote 6, Suellen. Okay, so yeah, of course you can have 2 sentence or 6 sentence paragraphs, but yes, no, but sure, this is really good. 5, 6 paragraphs. So I'm curious to see a few examples. So who of you would like to show what you've written so far and briefly explain how you've approached it? Perhaps is sort of a making of the writing. What decisions have you made? Why have you structured it in a certain way? I guess you should be able to share your screen. Is that true or not?
I wrote it on a paper.
Ah, you wrote it on the paper. Hey, who is sharing this right now, Vanessa?
Yeah, I can share my screen.
Yeah, I already saw something, but yeah.
I don't know if it's correct.
Yeah.
It's possible to see the Word document.
Yeah,
okay.
I can see it. Yeah, if you could, yeah, I see, don't completely see it. So if you could zoom out slightly, then...
It's good now?
Yeah, now just zoom out a little, actually. Yeah, so it really shows it very large, in my screen at least. I'm not sure how it's for others, but...
I will, 1 minute.
Yeah.
Now it's better.
Yeah, that's better. Yeah, great. Okay.
Yeah, the idea, I try to start with a general issue to connect with concrete structures, and I wrote more relative to my topic because it's easier to me. Yeah, and then I introduced the environment conditions that I will study, and then I enter in the self-healing concrete, explain the types of shortly the types of self-healing concretes available, and yeah, what is the best way of, what is the aim of my work, and in the end, yeah, I try to create some paragraph to introduce what is the aim of the project that I am inside.
Yeah. Okay, looks good. Yeah, so from broad you move to narrow, and I think it's nice to see that you included a few key phrases or signaling phrases, right? And the end, the final paragraph, I think you say the potential, knowing the potential will present the best efficiency, will bring knowledge for, thus it seeks to fill these gaps, right? So yeah, that's clear. Then you know that what you've read before, that you've defined the gaps there. So that's nice. Okay, were you able to use the references that you found here, or other reference, or where would do you think you would need them to back up what you say?
Yeah, for sure, I didn't have time to this, but
no, sure.
Yeah, in this paragraph that I describe other types of self-healing concretes, or when I made some examples for the extreme conditions involved in my project, it's good to mention other projects already, other studies related to this that are available.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah, clear. Yeah, so it's nice to see that already without really reading it in a very detailed way, you could see that you start off more broadly, and then in the second or in the third paragraph, you see these abbreviations and these very specific concepts, or ECC, UHP, FRC, and those are immediate indicators that at that point you're starting to narrow down, right? And that is typically not something that you would start off with. So that's already shows that pattern nicely. Maybe already, anticipating on something that I might touch upon if we have enough time in a minute, is sort of the connection between paragraphs, and how to make sure that for a reader you have a nice flow. And I think just by scanning your paragraphs, it seems that you are making nice topic sentences. And topic sentence then is sort of the first sentence of a paragraph that more or less covers the main idea of the paragraph. When you look at, for example, the connection between first and second paragraph, you sort of state the general issue, right? And then the second paragraph starts with, the self-healing concrete approach is a smart alternative to this common problem. What could occur if you're reading this is that you have to establish for yourself that apparently this is a common problem, right? And when you start this first sentence of the second paragraph, you're suddenly confronted with a new concept, which is the self-healing concrete approach, right? So then as a reader, you might be thinking, oh, what should I do with this? And then the second half of the sentence contains something that you've already read, a smart alternative to this common problem, and that refers to the previous paragraph. So one way to organize sort of a smooth transition could also be to turn the two parts of that sentence around and start off with, a smart alternative to this common problem is the self-healing concrete approach. And then you start off with something that I've just read, which is a common problem, and then you present a new concept, which is self-healing concrete approach, right? So that is sort of a common writing principle that is the old new principle, and I think it's nice to but of course it's fine if that is not in place immediately, but that's something to keep in mind when you want to connect paragraphs, is that for a reader it's often very helpful if you start off with something to relate it to something that you've just read, which is known information, and then connect the new concept to that, so that you sort of have a nice flow throughout the text. And maybe that's not always possible, but it's nice to have that as a sort of a general rule of thumb in your mind. Nice writing. Yeah, to just in 30 minutes. Is there anyone else who would like to share his or her work, or would like to comment on Vanessa's introduction?
Yeah, I would like to share.
Yeah, sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see here. Just a moment, because I'm now trying to share.
Yeah, I see it.
Are seen or not?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I can see it. Yeah.
I will in the Zoom. Okay. So first of all, I try to define what is my material, my objective, and in the second paragraph, also the history of the use of the cementitious grouts, and in the third, I try to establish a connection with nowadays and currently. And then I try to present the gap of my research, and the last one, my purpose of my study. And I try to highlight here for me the keywords of to make some connection between the paragraphs.
Yeah.
are
Yes,
seeing
sorry, I'm just...
my quiz or not? Because I'm not sure if you're seeing my test.
Yeah, I can see. Yeah.
Ah, okay, sorry.
I can see the text. I was just reading the first paragraph, but overall, I think it's nice that you highlighted the main structure markers. So and how, you know, the keywords that show the storyline. So over the years, right? So that is typically you announce to the reader, okay, now I'm going to show an overview of what has been done in this field, and then you move to in the next paragraph you move to currently. So indeed you have this nice contrast there from back then to now. And then what I also saw is although, which is good. Of course, it's sort of already prepares the reader for a typical indication of the gap, right? Although this is going on, still, right? This is needed. And then therefore is a nice indicator of the summary of the gap, and the proposed study aims to. I think that is a very clear indication of the purpose. So that really, if you're as a experienced reader, sort of introductions, which usually the audience or the readers of your texts are, right? Those usually are people who know what kind of text to expect. These are typically the words and the links that you're looking for. So that's nice to see. The only thing I was wondering is the first paragraph where you start with the grout is defined as a fluid mixture of binders. I can imagine that maybe if you're really into this topic, then it makes sense that you start off with this definition. But for me, when I read this first sentence, I'm looking for some context, right? So I'm thinking, okay, why are you defining this here? And so what is this needed for? Is this an important material? Is it, right? So the importance, establishing the importance, that is what after just reading this first sentence, I don't immediately have a good idea about. So I could imagine that you first say grout is, you know, an important material, or it's important in these or these contexts, and this is how it's defined, right? So and that you need the definition later on to, you know, move on into why you have a certain purpose or aim. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
But that's maybe someone who knows quite a bit about the topic doesn't really have a problem with it. So, that's my initial feeling when I see the first paragraph. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Anyone else who'd care to share? Maybe we have room for one more example, or would like to comment or give some more feedback. Guess it's not.
I can share mine.
Yeah, nice.
So my topic is universities, actually a technology transfer from university to industry in the construction sector. So the first one, I put the whole of universities. Can you all see my screen?
Yeah.
And then I point the channels, the different channels of commercialization. The second paragraph, I just put why I'm going to do this technology transfer in the construction sector instead of, because, I mean, just too broad. And then the third one about the construction in general, innovations in construction actually. And then the last one, I just put number of studies doing this study between technology transfer, university industry collaboration in the construction sector, but I didn't finalize my introduction with the goal and none of that.
Okay. Thanks, Ace. Yeah. So it's nice to see how you already could include these references in nicely in your draft. So yeah, that's shows that you can use the sources easily, or that you are, you have a good idea already how, what the main information is you can use from them. So what I am wondering when I read the first sentence of the second paragraph, which says the literature is full of relevant studies in the transfer of technology from university to industry. I am now looking for where I read the word transfer of technology in the first paragraph. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah. It's because I use commercialization here, and then I use transfer of technology, but I didn't do the link.
Yeah. So if that is the first sentence of the second paragraph, then I expect that you've said something about transfer of technology in the first paragraph, right?
Sure.
And maybe you did, but you didn't label it as such. But maybe you used a different way of phrasing it. But I think here it's important to just use similar concepts, because otherwise a reader might be confused. And okay, is transfer of technology the same as what you just described in the previous or the final sentence of the first paragraph? Do you mean with that transfer of technology, or is it something new that I should be aware of or that I should know of? Yeah. So okay, I think that is, I think it's a good, usually a good way of checking your the flow in your text, to read the first sentence of your paragraph and to see, okay, is this indeed linking to the previous paragraph, what I read, and am I using similar concepts there? Can a reader logically understand that this follows from what I've just explained, right? And that it's not something new. And that is, I find also in courses in writing courses that I teach, is one of the bigger challenges in scientific text. So I mean, it's completely understandable that in draft versions that's something that happens a lot. And I know when I'm writing, I do that quite a bit as well, because when you're expert in a certain field, you are so, and especially in your own topic, you're so aware, you're so knowledgeable, and you know exactly what's going on there, that you understand how different concepts relate to one another. But for someone who reads the text for the first time, it's not always clear if yeah, that is also what you intend as a writer, right? So if what you exactly mean. So then it's always helpful to look at it from the perspective of a reader who just reads this text for the first time and should be able to understand all the steps that you take. And for that, I think the paragraph is usually a very useful structure, you could say, because it's a clear chunk that you can see, coherent piece of text that should somehow be related. Those paragraphs should somehow be related to one another. So that helps you by scanning your text already to form an opinion on how well it is structured.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, but nice start as well. I'm impressed by how quickly you are able to write these texts.
Yeah, actually, I'm working on this. So I had some sentences before, and then I just wrap everything now because I have to write. Actually, I'm doing coding frame, but I have to write in 1 month. So
okay. Well, then, yeah, it's nice that you could use that, and maybe sometimes writing is also, putting together what you already have and having, putting the pieces together, and just sometimes you put your thoughts on paper, and then for one project, and then for another you have to choose a slightly different perspective. So yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, thanks. So let's take a look at the time. Well, we might have time for one final example. One of you would like to show what you've done? No one?
If I manage to share my screen, I would definitely.
Okay. Are you trying to, Gabriele?
Yes, yes.
Yeah,
Let me
okay.
see if I can. You see it?
Something's happening now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So I didn't write that much actually. So at the beginning, I started with the background, so sort of the territory we were talking about earlier, and the significance of research in this field. Then the literature review, the present state of the art, then the gaps that I found so far, the aim of my research, and the possible significance of this research in a broader environment context.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you quickly scan it, you know, and just by reading the first sentences already gives you a hint of how this text is structured, right? So during the last few decades, at the moment, right? So then you immediately have an idea of the the chunk or the gist of that these paragraphs, and then you can expect that if you read during the last few decades, then the rest of the paragraph will develop that, right, or support that. So so that is nice. What I was wondering when you read, when you quickly scan the third or fourth paragraph, maybe you can, okay, so although an impressive number of researches have emerged, so that already prepares the reader for a gap, right? So that also is quite clear. And then you have the principal aim of this research, and the next sentence states the main goal is to. So what exactly is the main aim? The first or the second sentence?
Yeah, true. Yeah.
So that is, if you read this, quickly scan it, right? Then you're looking for these hints or these typical words, and then those two, yeah, both seem to express a main aim, but it's not immediately clear which is the most, well, principle. But then if you say principal aim, then it also suggests that there are sub-aims that you should, you know, that we are not yet aware of, perhaps, right? If that's the case, then that's fine, but then you shouldn't make that clear, or otherwise, maybe you should just leave out principle and just say the aim of this research is, and then you just have the, and then don't refer to the main goal, but maybe, you know, choose another way to phrase the following sentence and show the relation with the main aim. Yeah, but overall, I think you're doing a nice job here. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. I think it's nice to see how in a. I think it's nice to see how in a short time you're just able to come up with a good text that can really serve as a basis for, yeah, a lot of text that you might be writing on your research topic. And of course, depending on, yeah, the context and the kind of journal or yeah, kind of text that you're going to write, then you can vary on that. But basically, the overall approach of your study, yeah, does not necessarily vary. So it's good to have this yeah, this pattern, I think, of how you could write these introductions, but not just in the introduction. You see that for other kinds of sections in scientific texts as well. So one thing, just in the final 10 minutes, maybe, one thing I wanted to show as well is that paragraph structure that I already hinted on a little bit, because a paragraph is really a good building block, you could say, that you could use in not just in the introduction, but when you get to the conclusion, for example, but also when describing results or discussion. Then essentially the same guidelines hold when you want to write good paragraphs, and that is that it should be just about just one idea that's expressed in the first sentence. Usually, sometimes you also see the final sentence, but often it's good if you scan the first sentences, the topic sentences, that you have a good idea of the overarching idea of the paragraph, and that the rest of the paragraph develops that idea, and that a clear paragraph structure leads to a clear storyline, so that you can use these signposts, transition markers, which we already discussed a few times, conjunctions and structure words. And what I also indicated briefly is that that idea, that principle of old, new, so that you first present old or known information and then connect the new information to it. That's just a good main principle to keep in mind when you're writing, because for people who are just first confronted with a text, that's a helpful guiding principle. If you understand how it's what is new information, how that always is related to what you've just read. And one of the really helpful resource for this is the online writing lab, OWL, and it's abbreviated of Purdue University. This link here on this slide, and you can find the links in the slides on Teams as well, is specifically on paragraphs, but it contains lots of information on all kinds of aspects of academic writing, and it really has lots of examples. So also a very good page on sentence clarity, for example. I really like that resource, and it's something that you can often check, and yeah, that can just provide you with a few good examples of best practices in writing, in academic writing typically. So yeah, I think we can move to the wrapping up this this session. I had a few examples of paragraphs in the slides as well, but it would take a bit too much time to go over them, so maybe you can check them out for yourselves, but they more or less underline this idea of good topic sentences and the old new connection that's clear for a reader. I'll move through them and move to the wrap up of today's session. So yeah, just 2 hours about writing. There is of course a lot to say about writing, and it's also, just as with public speaking, about practicing and writing a lot and getting some good feedback. So also don't forget to regularly ask for feedback from perhaps a professional, but also from colleagues, and not just on the content, but also on the writing, right? So on the structure of the text and on the language, because that really makes you a better writer. And of course, you will get good feedback, or you need good feedback on the scientific content as well, but it's good to try and they are often related, content and structure and language, but it's also good to sometimes focus on the writing aspects and not only on the content. So think about who you write for, readers, genre, context, what kind of academic text are you writing, what patterns do you see, what is already known, what do the readers expect of this typical text, and then try to match those expectations as well as possible, but don't necessarily copy exactly what other researchers have been doing either, right? So yeah, make the trade-off whether that approach also matches your specific topic. Facilitate your own writing process. So also that's good. find out what works best for you. Are you the one who needs to structure everything in advance and then starts to write the full sentences, or are you someone who just starts writing out of the blue and tries to get your thoughts on paper and then structures afterwards? If you feel that you are stuck or that you have a writer's block, this sometimes also can help to to choose a completely different approach, right? So if you're always the structuring type, maybe it's good at some point, if you feel that it doesn't really work, to just start writing and do it completely different for a change. We're usually creatures of habit, so also when we're writing, we usually tend to do it exactly the same way, but sometimes when you're writing, it's good to take a completely different approach. And for the introduction, right? Yeah, I think it's clear what the basic approach is and what usually is done there. So it's good to have that in mind and vary on that pattern to the extent that you think it's necessary, with effective paragraphs that have topic sentences according to the old new principle. So the online writing lab is a very helpful resource. I already mentioned. Another one is the academic phrase bank of the Manchester University, which contains per topic and per function of the text, for example, highlighting new research versus old, or contrasting approaches in the introduction. It is a very broad database with lots of examples of typical academic language or language that is used in academic texts. So sometimes you don't have to reinvent the wheel, but if you're looking for an expression that sort of highlights what you want to say, what the relation that you want to express at that moment, it might be helpful to check that out once, and because then you can see how other scholars have formulated that, and then you can be inspired by that. That model of Swales and Feek, there's also a useful link on that with some more information, and just that book, as I said, this one, Academic Writing for Graduate Students, I can really recommend it. Just as the book of Søren Johnson, a colleague of mine, not just because he's a colleague of mine at Center for Languages and Academic Skills, but because his work, Getting It Across, really a guide to effective academic writing, is also focuses more on the linguistic aspects of writing academic English. So that also can really help when you get to that point. Okay, and there's much more to be discovered, but I think this is these are a few helpful resources and a good introduction to the topic. So to wrap up, yeah, thanks for your efforts and for your work today. And I think when it comes to presenting and writing, I think you made a very nice start, and something that you can build on the rest of the week, but perhaps also after. So it was a pleasure working with you today. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Martijn, for this very interesting day. I liked it a lot. I hope all our PhD students also liked it. I also learned new things, how to present and how to start writing. So I think it was very useful, and we could already see that they picked up a lot of stuff with the exercises, so that's really good. So thank you very much for today. And,
you're welcome.
We're happy to follow the rest of the course, so you can stay if you want, but you can imagine that you have other things to do too.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you, and good luck the rest of the week as well. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.